My name is Sarah Mitchell, and at 32, I thought I understood what family sacrifice meant. As a registered nurse at Cleveland Clinic making $65,000 a year, I'd always been the reliable daughter who put everyone else first. When my parents, Bob and Linda Hayes, lost their apartment and needed somewhere to stay, I opened my home without hesitation. I paid their bills, covered their expenses, and never questioned why they always seemed to need just a little more help each month. Even when my 7-year-old daughter Emma faced emergency surgery and medical bills I couldn't afford, I still made excuses for why they couldn't contribute. But the night my father screamed pay rent or get out instead of helping his own granddaughter, something fundamental shifted inside me. As I stood there nursing a split lip with my terrified daughter watching, I decided to do something I'd never done before. I started looking through the mail that had been piling up on my kitchen counter, the bills and statements I'd been too overwhelmed to examine closely. What I found in those innocent-looking envelopes would make me question everything I thought I knew about the people who raised me. Sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who sleep in the room next to yours. Sometimes helping your family means discovering truths you never wanted to know. And sometimes protecting the people you love requires betraying the people you've loved longest. The question that would define the next 2 years of my life was simple but terrifying when you realize your family isn't who you thought they were. How far are you willing to go to find out who they really are? Looking back, now I can see how perfectly normal everything appeared from the outside. I lived in a modest apartment in Lakewood, Ohio, drove a reliable Honda Civic, and Emma attended a good public school just 3 blocks away. We looked like we were managing just fine, which was exactly what I wanted everyone to believe. The truth was much more complicated. $45,000 in student loans from nursing school followed me around like a shadow that never shortened. Then there was the $23,000 in medical debt from my late husband, Michael's cancer treatment. He'd fought so bravely for 2 years, and even with insurance, the bills had accumulated faster than I could pay them down. $800 a month for Emma's childcare when I worked my shifts, plus all the normal expenses of raising a child alone. My family had always counted on me to be the stable one. My older brother David couldn't stay away from poker machines and online betting sites long enough to hold steady employment. My younger sister Jessica changed career plans every few months, always convinced the next opportunity would make her rich without requiring any actual work. So when Bob and Linda got evicted from their apartment in late 2020, I did what felt natural. I offered them my spare bedroom until they could get back on their feet. Bob was 58 then, a construction worker whose back injury had ended his career earlier than planned. The disability payments barely covered basic expenses, and Linda's part-time position as secretary at Sacred Heart Church brought in maybe $800 a month on a good month. They needed help, and I was the daughter with steady income and space to spare. 4 years later, temporarily had become a permanent arrangement that was slowly crushing my financial stability and my peace of mind. Bob's injury had led to prescription pain medications, and when doctors became reluctant to prescribe them long-term, he'd found other ways to cope with chronic pain and unemployment frustration. Lottery scratch-offs at first, then small bets on sports games, then weekend trips to the casino over in Pennsylvania. His gambling habit grew steadily worse, but Linda covered for him, made excuses, and somehow convinced herself that the next big win was always just around the corner. Meanwhile, I was expected to contribute $400 monthly in rent for the privilege of housing them in my own apartment, plus cover most of the groceries and utilities. Every month felt like running uphill in quicksand, but Bob made it sound like I was the one being helped. "You make good money at that hospital," he'd say whenever I mentioned money being tight. "We raised you, put you through school, gave you everything you needed to succeed. Time to pay us back for all those years of investment." I paid because I didn't want to fight. I paid because they were family. I paid because I thought that's what love looked like. Last Tuesday started with a double shift in the ICU, 12 hours of monitoring critical patients and managing medical emergencies that required every bit of my training and experience. My feet ached, my lower back was stiff, and all I wanted was to collect Emma from after-school care and spend a quiet evening at home. Instead, my phone rang at 4:30 in the afternoon with the kind of call that stops your heart. "This is Fairlawn Elementary calling about Emma Mitchell. She's experiencing severe abdominal pain, and we think you should come immediately." The school nurse, Mrs. Patterson, looked genuinely worried when I arrived to find Emma curled up on the health office cot, pale and sweating and trying not to cry. "Her symptoms started about an hour ago, and they're getting worse. I really think you should take her straight to the emergency room." Cleveland Clinic's emergency department moved quickly once they assessed Emma's condition, CT scans, blood work, IV fluids, and the kind of medical attention that reminded me why I'd chosen healthcare as my career. The diagnosis came back clear and terrifying: acute appendicitis. We need to operate tonight to prevent rupture. The surgery went perfectly. Emma was brave and recovered beautifully, and the surgeon assured me we'd caught the condition before any serious complications developed. Insurance covered the hospital stay and the procedure itself, but there were still out-of-pocket expenses that added up quickly. Prescription medications for pain management, special wound care supplies, follow-up appointments with the pediatric surgeon. $800 in additional costs that might as well have been $8,000 for all the available money I had. My credit cards were already maxed from months of covering household expenses that Bob and Linda couldn't or wouldn't handle. My checking account had maybe $200 until the next paycheck, and that was already committed to Emma's childcare. Sitting in that hospital parking lot with Emma sleeping peacefully in her car seat, I did something I hadn't done in months. I swallowed my pride and called my parents to ask for help. Bob answered on the fourth ring, his voice thick with sleep and something else I preferred not to identify. "Sarah, it's nearly midnight. What's wrong, Dad? Emma had emergency appendix surgery tonight. She's fine now, but I need help covering the medical expenses that insurance won't pay. Just this once." The silence stretched so long I wondered if the call had dropped. Then Bob's voice came back colder than the October air outside my car. "How much money are we talking about? $800? I know it's a lot, but she's your granddaughter, and I'm completely out of options financially. $800. He repeated the amount like I'd asked him to buy me a yacht. "Sarah, you make more money than Linda and I see in 2 months combined." "Dad, I give you $400 every month in rent. Plus, I pay for most of the groceries and utilities in the apartment. Emma is 7 years old and just had major surgery." Another pause. Then his voice turned hard in a way that made my chest tighten. "You need to get your priorities straight, Sarah. Pay your fair share first. We're tired of supporting a freeloading daughter who thinks she's better than her own family." The line went dead. I sat in that parking lot staring at my phone, trying to process what had just happened. My daughter had nearly died from a medical emergency, and my father's response was to hang up on me because I'd asked for help with her treatment costs. When I got home, Bob and Linda's bedroom door was closed, but I could see light underneath and hear the television playing. They were awake. They'd just decided my emergency wasn't worth their time or concern. The next evening after work, I approached the subject carefully, hoping that a face-to-face conversation might go differently than the phone call. Bob was in his usual spot by the living room window, surrounded by losing lottery tickets. Linda was in the kitchen making herself a sandwich, deliberately ignoring my presence. "How's Emma feeling today?" I asked, thinking that grandparental concern might soften the conversation. "She's fine," Linda replied without looking up from her food preparation, "though I don't understand why you couldn't take time off work to stay home with her yourself." Some mothers would put their children first. I felt something crack inside my chest. I do put Emma first. That's why I work double shifts and live on credit cards so I can give you money I don't have for rent in my own apartment. Bob's voice cut across the room like a blade. "Don't start with the attitude, Sarah. You think because you went to nursing school that you're something special. But you live here because we allow you to live here. You eat food we buy with our grocery money." "Our grocery money?" I turned to face him directly, feeling 4 years of suppressed resentment rising to the surface. "What grocery money?" "Dad, the disability check that disappears on scratch-off tickets." "Mom's part. Time church salary that goes to casino trips." He stood up from his chair, and something dangerous flashed in his eyes. Something that reminded me why I usually kept quiet and paid the rent and pretended everything was perfectly normal. "You better watch how you talk to me in my own house," he said, taking a step toward me. "Your house?" I stepped backward, suddenly aware that Emma was watching from the couch with wide, frightened eyes. "This is my apartment, Dad. My lease, my name on the utilities." "Pay your fair share first," he repeated, moving closer until I could smell beer and anger on his breath. "We're tired of a freeloading daughter who thinks she's better than family." Before I could respond, before I could defend myself or point out the financial reality of our situation, Bob's hand cracked across my face with a sound that seemed to echo in the small room. I stumbled backward, tasting blood where my teeth had cut the inside of my cheek. Emma screamed from the couch. Linda continued making her sandwich like nothing unusual had happened. Bob stood over me with a cold satisfaction that made my stomach turn. "Pay rent or get out of our lives," he said. That night, after Emma had finally fallen asleep and my parents had retreated to their room, I sat at my kitchen table with a bag of frozen vegetables pressed against my swollen cheek, trying to understand what my life had become. I'd been supporting them financially for 4 years. I'd given them a place to live when they had nowhere else to go. I'd covered their expenses, made excuses for Bob's gambling, and maintained the fiction that we were a happy family, just helping each other through difficult times. And when I'd asked for help with my child's medical emergency, they'd responded with demands, accusations, and physical violence. I got up to find some aspirin in the bathroom medicine cabinet, and that's when I noticed them. Stacked on my dresser, partially hidden under some of Linda's magazines, were envelopes addressed to me that I'd never seen before. Bank statements, credit card applications, official documents with my name printed in address windows, but all of them had been opened and then carefully resealed with tape. My hands shook as I picked up the first envelope. Inside was a credit card statement for an account I'd never opened, showing a balance of over $3,000 and payments that were months overdue. Then another envelope, and another. Bank statements for accounts I didn't recognize. Loan applications bearing signatures that looked like mine but felt wrong somehow. Credit card approvals for cards I'd never requested. $15,000 in debt that I'd never created, all in my name, all at my address, all accessible to people who'd been living in my home and handling my mail for 4 years. I sat surrounded by evidence of something I didn't want to understand, my face still throbbing from Bob's hand, my daughter sleeping peacefully in the next room, completely unaware that everything we thought we knew about our family was built on lies. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table until dawn, spreading out every piece of mail I'd found, trying to make sense of the financial nightmare laid out in front of me. Credit cards from Chase, Capital One, Discover. Personal loans from online lenders I'd never heard of. Even a store credit account at Best Buy showing purchases of electronics. Also, didn't own. $15,000 in debt that I'd never created, all bearing my name and social security number. When Emma woke up around 7, I quickly stuffed everything back into a shoebox and hid it in my bedroom closet. She was still sore from surgery but feeling better, chattering about her favorite cartoon while I made her scrambled eggs. I tried to smile and nod in all the right places, but my mind kept circling back to those statements, those signatures that looked like mine but felt wrong somehow. At Cleveland Clinic, I went through the motions of my shift like a robot. My supervisor, Patricia Wong, noticed something was off. "Sarah, you seem distracted today. Is everything okay at home?" "Just tired," I said. "Emma had surgery 2 days ago. Still adjusting." During my lunch break, I called the customer service number on one of the credit card statements. After navigating through an automated menu designed to frustrate people into hanging up, I finally reached a human being. "Hi, I'm calling about my account. I think there might be some fraudulent charges." The woman was professionally polite but clearly skeptical. "Can I have your social security number and mother's maiden name for verification?" I provided the information, my stomach nodding as I waited. "Okay, Mrs. Mitchell, I see your account was opened in March of last year. The application was submitted online and the card was mailed to your address in Lakewood. Is there a specific charge you're questioning?" "I never applied for this card. I've never even heard of your bank before today." "Ma'am, I show regular payments being made on this account for the past 18 to 10 months. The payments are coming from a checking account with your name on it." "That's impossible." "What checking account?" She rattled off numbers that meant nothing to me. "Ma'am, this is clearly your account. You've been making minimum payments consistently." I hung up feeling more confused than before. Someone was making payments on debt I hadn't created, from an account I didn't recognize, and somehow it was all connected to me. That evening, I waited until Bob and Linda went to bed before making more calls. Each conversation was variations of the same theme: accounts opened in my name, debt accumulated over months or years, payments being made from mysterious sources that kept the accounts from going into default. The pattern was too sophisticated to be accidental. This wasn't random identity theft. This was systematic, organized, and it was happening right under my own roof. I called my brother David the next morning. He answered on the 4th ring, his voice thick with sleep. "Sarah, what's up?" "You never call this early." "David, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Do you know anything about Mom and Dad opening credit accounts in my name?" Silence, then a long exhale that told me everything I needed to know. "You knew about this. Mom asked me to help set up an email account. Said it was for family emergency funds and you'd approved it. She needed to respond to some financial stuff, and you were always working such long hours. It seemed harmless." My heart sank. "What kind of email account, one with your name on it?" "Something like Sarah.Mitchell Family Fund at Gmail." She said she needed to communicate with banks and loan companies about consolidating family debt. Made it sound like you were helping everyone get their finances straightened out. David, Mom and Dad have been using my identity to take out loans and credit cards. They've stolen thousands of dollars in my name. Jesus, Sarah, I swear I didn't know it was like that. Mom said it was all legitimate. Said you were too busy to handle the paperwork yourself. David had been in and out of Gamblers Anonymous for 3 years. But something in his voice sounded different this time. More sincere maybe, or just more tired. After I hung up with David, I sat at my kitchen table staring at my laptop screen. The family emergency email account he'd described would have given Bob and Linda access to financial communications in my name. They could have applied for loans, responded to verification requests, even made arrangements for automatic payments. I thought about last Thanksgiving, when my Aunt Maria had pulled me aside and thanked me for helping with Uncle Frank's surgery costs. I'd been confused at the time, but she'd been so grateful that I'd just smiled and changed the subject. Now I was beginning to understand. I made a list of everyone who'd thanked me over the past 2 years for financial help I'd never provided: Cousin Jennifer's car repair, Aunt Rosa's roof replacement, Uncle Tony's business loan. Every time I'd been confused by their gratitude, but I'd never pushed for details. Bob and Linda had been running some kind of family charity scam using my name and reputation. They were collecting money from relatives, probably claiming it was going into an emergency fund that I was managing as the responsible daughter with the steady job and nursing degree. The next morning, I called in sick to work and drove to downtown Cleveland to meet with Marcus Thompson, a financial attorney who specialized in identity theft cases. His office was in one of those old buildings near the courthouse, with marble floors and brass fixtures that had seen better days, but still commanded respect. Marcus was younger than I'd expected, maybe early 40s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "This is systematic fraud," he said after reviewing the documents I'd brought. "Your parents have been using your identity for financial gain for at least 2 years, probably longer. The sophistication of the operation suggests planning and intent." What does that mean exactly? It means this isn't just a family financial misunderstanding, this is criminal activity. Identity theft, wire fraud, possibly mail fraud if they've been intercepting your correspondence. Can they really go to jail for this? Marcus nodded grimly. Federal prison if the charges cross state lines. And based on what you've shown me, with the Pennsylvania casino transactions and the online lending, they definitely do. That evening, Mrs. Rosenberg knocked on my door. Eleanor Rosenberg was my landlord, a sweet woman in her 70s who lived in the duplex next door. "Sarah, dear, your mother mentioned that you'd be willing to co-sign the lease renewal for next year, and I wanted to discuss the terms with you directly." My blood ran cold. "I'm sorry, what did my mother tell you?" "She said you'd been handling the family finances, and that you'd guarantee the lease if anything happened to their income, Mrs. Rosenberg. I never agreed to co-sign anything." "What exactly did my mother sign?" Eleanor looked confused, then concerned. She pulled out documents with my signature at the bottom. Neat, careful handwriting that looked exactly like mine, but that I'd never written. As I looked at my forged signature on those lease documents, something inside me finally snapped into place. This wasn't just about credit cards and loans. Bob and Linda had been systematically stealing my identity for years, using my name and reputation to cover their tracks, collect money from family members, and secure housing they couldn't afford on their own. Every proud parent moment, every time they'd brag about their successful daughter to neighbors in church, friends, every grateful relative who'd thanked me for help I'd never given. It was all built on lies they'd created using my name. I was done being the good daughter. I was done paying for the privilege of being stolen from in my own home. It was time to find out just how deep this rabbit hole went. The first call I made was to the Social Security Administration. I'd been dreading this conversation, but Marcus Thompson had told me it was essential to document everything if I wanted to build a case. After 20 minutes on hold listening to elevator music that made my teeth I finally reached a representative named Beverly who sounded like she'd been answering these calls for about 30 years. "Ma'am, I'm showing that someone did attempt to change your mailing address for benefit statements back in July. The request was denied because the signature didn't match our records exactly. Someone tried to redirect my Social Security mail. When in July 15th. The request came from your current address in Lakewood, but like I said, we flagged it as suspicious and denied the change." I felt sick to my stomach. July 15th was right around the time Bob had been complaining about money being tight, when his gambling losses had gotten particularly bad according to David. My next call was to Experian, then Equifax, then TransUnion. Each credit reporting agency told me the same horrifying story. 7 unauthorized accounts opened in my name over the past 24 months. Personal loans, store credit cards, even a gas station credit account I'd never heard of. The total damage was actually worse than I'd initially thought. $22,000 in debt across all the accounts, not 15 like I'd calculated from the statements I'd found. By the time I finished those calls, my hands were shaking and I needed coffee. I drove to the little diner near the hospital where I sometimes grabbed breakfast before my shifts. The waitress Ruby poured me a cup without being asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost, honey." "Everything all right, just dealing with some family stuff, Ruby. You know how it is." The next morning, I cornered Patricia Wong in the break room at work. She was reviewing patient charts while eating a yogurt, probably the only thing she'd have time to eat until dinner. "Patricia, can I talk to you about something personal?" She looked up from her charts, immediately giving me her full attention. "Of course. What's going on?" I took a deep breath and told her everything. The credit cards I hadn't applied for the forged signatures, the realization that my parents had been stealing my identity for years. Patricia listened without interrupting, her expression growing more concerned with each detail. "Sarah, this is serious. Have you contacted law enforcement? I'm working with an attorney who specializes in identity theft. He says it could become a federal case if it crosses state lines." Patricia set down her yogurt and looked at me with the focused intensity she brought to critical care situations. "I want you to know that you have resources available through the hospital's employee assistance program. And I want you to document everything that's happening at home, especially if you're feeling unsafe. Unsafe." The word hit me harder than I'd expected. Was I unsafe? Bob had hit me once, but that was just anger and frustration. Right, except it didn't feel normal. It felt like the beginning of something worse. When I got home that afternoon, Emma was at the kitchen table working on homework while Linda microwaved leftover pizza. Bob was in his usual spot by the window, surrounded by losing scratch-off tickets and empty beer cans. "How was work, dear?" Linda asked with fake sweetness. "You've been putting in so many extra hours lately." Something in her tone made me suspicious. Since when did Linda care about my work schedule that evening? After Emma went to bed, I called David again. This time, he answered on the first ring, which told me he'd been expecting my call. "I need to know exactly what Mom asked you to help with, David. Every detail you can remember." "Sarah, I told you everything yesterday. The email account responding to some financial stuff. That was it." "No, that wasn't it. Because I've been doing research, and someone has been making payments on these fraudulent accounts to keep them from going into default. Someone who knows enough about financial systems to keep everything looking legitimate." Silence on the other end. Then quietly he said, "Mom might have asked me to set up some automatic transfers between accounts. She said it was to simplify the family budget." "What kind of transfers?" David sighed, and I could hear the weight of guilt in his breathing. "Small amounts. 50 here, 100 there. She said you'd authorized it, but were too busy to handle the technical stuff yourself. She gave me account numbers and routing information. Account numbers for accounts I'd never opened, using money from sources I'd never authorized. My own brother had been helping my parents steal from me for months, convinced he was doing me a favor." "David, I need you to understand something. I never authorized any of this. Mom and Dad have been committing identity theft and fraud in my name. They've stolen over $20,000, and they've used you to help them do it." The silence stretched so long I thought he might have hung up. Finally, his voice came through small and broken. "Oh God, Sarah, what have I done?" The next step was contacting the FBI. Marcus Thompson had given me the number for Agent Rivera at the Financial Crimes Unit in Cleveland. I'd been putting off this call because it felt like crossing a line I couldn't cross. Once the FBI got involved, this became real in a way that family confrontations and attorney meetings somehow didn't. Agent Rivera had a calm, professional voice that somehow made me feel both safer and more terrified at the same time. She asked detailed questions about timelines, account numbers, the technical aspects of how the fraud had been executed. "Mrs. Mitchell, based on what you're telling me, this appears to be a sophisticated identity theft operation with multiple victims. The Pennsylvania casino transactions alone make this a federal matter because it crosses state lines. Multiple victims. I thought this was just about me and some family members. We'll need to investigate further, but identity theft schemes rarely target just one person. If your parents have been doing this to you, they've likely been doing it to others as well." After I hung up with Agent Rivera, I sat in my car in the hospital parking lot trying to process what she'd said. Multiple victims. A sophisticated operation. These weren't words you'd use to describe family financial misunderstandings, or even desperate people making bad choices. These were words you'd use to describe criminals, but they were still my parents. They were still the people who'd raised me, who'd celebrated my graduations and walked me down the aisle at my wedding. How do you reconcile love with betrayal on this scale? That night, Bob cornered me in the kitchen while I was making Emma's lunch for school. You've been making a lot of phone calls lately, Sarah. Spending a lot of time on that computer. Is everything all right? His tone was casual, but there was something underneath it that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. A threat maybe, or a warning. Just taking care of some financial stuff, Dad. You know how it is. He moved closer, close enough that I could smell the beer on his breath and see the red veins in his eyes. Close enough that I remembered how hard his hand had felt across my face just a week ago. Family business should stay in the family, Sarah. You understand me? We don't need outsiders getting involved in our private affairs. I nodded and kept making Emma's sandwich, my hands steady even though my heart was racing. Because I understood exactly what he was telling me, and I understood that my situation had just become much more dangerous than I'd realized. The investigation was moving forward whether Bob wanted it to or not. And I was about to discover just how far their crimes extended beyond our family. Agent Rivera called me back 3 days later with news that made my stomach drop to the floor. Mrs. Mitchell, we've been investigating your case, and I need to tell you that this is much bigger than we initially thought. Your parents appear to have been running a multi-victim fraud operation for at least 3 years. I was sitting in my car during my lunch break, trying to eat a sandwich that suddenly tasted like cardboard. Multiple victims. The words echoed in my head like a warning bell. How many victims are we talking about? So far, we've identified 14 people across 3 states. The total estimated fraud is approaching $67,000. $67,000. I had to pull over to the side of the road because my hands were shaking too badly to drive safely. Agent Rivera continued in that calm, professional voice that somehow made everything sound both more and less terrifying. Your mother has been collecting money from Sacred Heart Church congregation for something called Sarah's Medical Mission Charity. The parishioners donated over $12,000, believing they were supporting international aid work in Honduras, a charity that doesn't exist. Using my name and my nursing credentials to make it sound legitimate, I felt like I was going to be sick. There's more. Your father has been approaching his former construction co-workers with investment opportunities. He's been telling them about his doctor-daughter's inside information on pharmaceutical stocks. 8 men have lost a combined $28,000 so far. I wasn't even a doctor, I was a nurse. But to men who worked construction for 30 years, anyone in scrubs probably looked like they had medical insider knowledge worth betting on. Mrs. Mitchell, I need you to know that the FBI considers this a priority case now. We'll be conducting interviews with victims over the next several weeks, and we'll likely need your cooperation as a witness. A witness against my own parents. The thought made me feel hollow inside, like something essential had been carved out and replaced with cold air. When I got home that evening, I found Jessica sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee, looking more nervous than I'd seen her in years. Sarah, we need to talk. Jessica was my baby sister, 29 years old and still living at home because she'd never managed to hold down a job for more than 6 months. She had our mother's blonde hair and our father's stubborn streak, and she'd been watching this whole investigation unfold from the inside. I know what Mom and Dad have been doing, she said without preamble. I've known for months, but I was scared to say anything because they threatened to kick me out if I told you. What exactly do you know, Jess? She pulled out her phone and showed me a series of text messages between her and Linda. Screenshots of conversations about expanding the church charity scam, about finding new investors for Bob's fake stock tips, about keeping me in the dark for as long as possible. They were planning to target the hospital staff next Sarah. Mom wanted to use your employee directory to find people who might invest in Dad's pharmaceutical insider trading scheme, my own colleagues. People I worked with every day, people who trusted me, people who saved lives alongside me in the ICU. My parents were planning to steal from them using my name and reputation. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Jessica's eyes filled with tears. Because I was scared. And because I was ashamed. I knew it was wrong, but they made it sound like you were okay with it. Like you were too busy to handle the details yourself, so they were helping manage your finances. Even Jessica had been convinced that I was somehow complicit in my own victimization. The scope of my parents' manipulation was breathtaking in its thoroughness. 2 days later, I got called into Human Resources at Cleveland Clinic. The meeting was with my supervisor, Patricia Wong, and the hospital's ethics coordinator, a serious woman named Janet Morrison who handled investigations of professional misconduct. Sarah, we need to discuss the FBI inquiry regarding your family situation, Patricia began gently. We've received requests for employment verification and background information as part of their investigation. My heart sank. Am I being suspended? Janet Morrison leaned forward, her expression businesslike but not unkind. You're being placed on administrative review pending the outcome of the federal investigation. This is standard procedure when an employee is involved in a financial crimes case, even as a victim. Administrative review meant no patient contact, no critical care responsibilities, no overtime shifts that I desperately needed to pay my bills. It meant sitting in an office doing paperwork and filing while my financial situation deteriorated even further. Dr. Wong spoke up forcefully. I wanted on record that Sarah is clearly the victim here, not the perpetrator. Her patient care has remained exemplary throughout this entire ordeal, and I believe she deserves our support, not additional punishment. Janet nodded. We understand that, Dr. Wong, but we have protocols to follow. Sarah, you'll be reassigned to administrative duties at full pay while the investigation continues. Once you're cleared, you'll return to your regular position. Full pay was something at least. But I knew this administrative review would show up in my employment file, would follow me if I ever needed to find a new job, would become part of my professional record whether I was cleared or not. That weekend, Emma started having nightmares again. I'd wake up to hear her crying in the next room, calling for me in a voice that sounded much younger than 7 years old. When I'd go to her, she'd cling to me and whisper things that broke my heart. Mommy or Grandpa and Grandma bad people. They made some very bad choices. Sweetheart, but that doesn't mean they don't love you. Are we going to be okay? Yes, baby, we're going to be okay. But I wasn't sure I believed it anymore. The investigation was picking up speed, and I was starting to understand that there might not be any way to protect Emma from the fallout. Kids at school were already asking questions about why her grandparents were on the news. The local paper had started covering the story as investment fraud targeting Northeast Ohio communities, and while they hadn't used my name yet, it was only a matter of time. Marcus Thompson called on Monday morning with an update that made everything feel even more surreal. Sarah, the federal prosecutors want to offer you immunity in exchange for your testimony against your parents. Full immunity from any potential charges related to the financial accounts opened in your name. Immunity. As if I might be charged with crimes my parents committed using my stolen identity. As if being their victim somehow made me complicit in their fraud operation. What happens if I don't testify? Then you remain vulnerable to potential charges if they try to claim you were a willing participant. The prosecutors don't think that will happen based on the evidence, but immunity eliminates any risk. I hung up the phone and sat in that sterile administrative office at the hospital, filing insurance claims and thinking about how completely my life had changed in just a few weeks. A month ago, my biggest worry was making rent and keeping up with Emma's school activities. Now I was facing the possibility of testifying against my own parents in federal court, watching my professional reputation get dragged through a public investigation, and trying to figure out how to explain to my 7-year-old daughter why her grandparents might be going to prison. The certified letter arrived that afternoon, delivered to the hospital because I'd had my mail redirected there to prevent my parents from intercepting anything else. When I opened it and saw the contents, I had to sit down because my legs suddenly felt too weak to support me. My parents had attempted to take out a $25,000 home equity loan using forged documents that claimed I was a co-owner of property I'd never seen, much less owned. The loan application had been denied, but only because the address verification had failed when the bank tried to confirm the property details. $25,000 they'd tried to steal using my name, my signature, and my credit history. Money they would have used to cover Bob's gambling debts and Linda's increasingly expensive attempts to maintain their image as successful parents with a prosperous daughter. I stared at those forged documents, at my signature that looked perfect but felt like a violation, and I realized that my parents weren't just thieves, they were professionals. The call came from Father Martinez at Sacred Heart Church on a Thursday morning while I was organizing medical supply inventories in the hospital basement. His voice was strained, like he'd been awake all night wrestling with what he had to tell me. Sarah, I'm calling about some irregularities we've discovered in our parish finances. I'm afraid your mother may have been involved in some unauthorized activities. My hands went cold around the phone. What kind of activities? Father, it appears that Linda has been collecting donations for a charity. That doesn't exist. Something called Sarah's Medical Mission to Honduras. She's been telling parishioners that you're organizing medical supply shipments to help children in Central America. A medical mission using my name and credentials to steal money from people who trusted their church secretary. I had to sit down on a stack of supply boxes because my knees suddenly felt unreliable. How much money are we talking about? Father, so far we've identified about $8,000 that was supposedly collected for this charity. But Sarah, there's something else. We've been going through the building fund accounts, and it appears that Linda may have diverted some of that money as well. The building fund. Money that parishioners had donated to repair the church roof and update the heating system. Money that elderly immigrants had scraped together from Social Security checks and minimum wage jobs because they believed in supporting their faith community. Father Martinez continued, his voice heavy with disappointment. Ms. Chen came to see me yesterday. She's been giving $50 a month to Linda's charity for 8 months, believing she was helping sick children. She showed me receipts that Linda gave her, but we have no record of any medical mission work, Mrs. Chen. I knew her from the few times I'd attended Mass with Linda. A tiny woman in her 70s who worked as a seamstress, still taking in alterations and repairs because her Social Security wasn't enough to live on. She probably made less in a month than I spent on groceries. Sarah, I want you to know that we don't hold you responsible for any of this. But I felt you should be aware of what's been happening in your name. After Father Martinez hung up, I sat in that basement storage room surrounded by boxes of medical supplies that actually existed, that actually saved lives. And I thought about all the Sundays Linda had come home from church talking about how grateful the congregation was for our family's service, how proud they were to have a nurse in their community who cared about helping people. They had been proud of me for charity work I'd never done, funded by their own donations that my mother had stolen. The local news picked up the story 2 days later. Channel 5 ran a segment called Investment Fraud Targeting Northeast Ohio Communities, and while they didn't use my name on air, anyone who knew our family would recognize the details. A church secretary and her construction worker husband accused of running multiple financial scams using their nurse daughter's credentials. I watched the broadcast in my apartment while Emma did homework at the kitchen table. The reporter interviewed some of Bob's former co-workers, men with calloused hands and tired eyes who talked about trusting their friend's daughter to help them invest their savings wisely. Jim Kowalski, a man I remembered from company picnics when I was a teenager, looked directly into the camera and said, "Bob told us his daughter had inside information about pharmaceutical stocks, said she worked with the doctors who knew which companies were developing breakthrough treatments. We trusted him because we trusted her. $7,000. That's what Jim had invested, money he'd been saving for his wife's knee replacement surgery. Now it was gone, and his wife was still limping around their house because they couldn't afford the procedure." Emma looked up from her math homework. "Mommy, why do people keep saying Grandpa and Grandma's names on TV? Just some grown-up problem, sweetheart. Nothing for you to worry about." But I could see the questions in her 7-year-old eyes, the confusion about why her grandparents were suddenly newsworthy, why kids at school were asking her about her family. The playground bullying started the next week. Emma came home with tears in her eyes and grass stains on her school clothes. Madison Reeves said our family are liars and thieves, she told me while I cleaned a scrape on her elbow. She said her daddy lost money because of us, and now they can't go to Disney World like they planned. I felt something crack inside my chest. Emma was paying the price for her grandparents' crimes, facing social consequences for actions she couldn't understand, carried out by people who were supposed to love and protect her. I called the school counselor the next morning and requested a meeting. Mrs. Patterson was understanding and professional, but the reality, she explained, was brutal. "Sarah, we'll do what we can to address the bullying, but you need to understand that this story has affected several families in our school district. Parents are angry, and unfortunately, children reflect their parents' emotions. I'm considering transferring Emma to a different school district. That might help, but news travels fast in communities like ours. The story has been picked up by several local outlets now." She was right. The Cleveland Plain Dealer ran a longer investigative piece titled, "Local Family Accused of Defrauding Church and Community Members." This time they did use my name, identifying me as either a victim or a potential co-conspirator, depending on how you interpreted the facts. The article included my photo from the Cleveland Clinic website, my professional headshot surrounded by details about fraud investigations and federal charges pending against my parents. My face, my name, my reputation, all tangled up with their crimes in a way that felt permanent and devastating. Patricia Wong found me crying in the hospital parking lot during my lunch break that day. She didn't say anything at first, just sat beside me on the bench and handed me tissues from her purse. "The article made it sound like you might have known what was happening," she said finally. "I didn't know anything. I was paying them rent in my own apartment while they were stealing my identity to commit fraud. But people are going to believe what they want to believe. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I've organized a petition. 17 nurses from our department have signed it so far. We're asking hospital administration to publicly support you during this investigation. Financial abuse victims shouldn't face professional punishment on top of everything else. 17 colleagues who believed in me enough to put their names on a document supporting my innocence. It wasn't everyone, but it was enough to remind me that not all relationships are built on lies and manipulation. Marcus Thompson called that evening with news that felt like both victory and final confirmation of how badly this was going to end. Sarah, the federal grand jury has returned indictments against your parents. 12 counts of wire fraud, 8 counts of identity theft, 5 counts of mail fraud. They'll be arrested within the next few days. Arrested? My parents were going to be arrested, probably at church or at home where Emma might see it happen, definitely in a way that would be public and humiliating for everyone involved. What happens next? Pre-trial detention hearings. Then a lengthy legal process. Based on the charges and the amount of money involved, they're looking at significant federal prison time if convicted. Federal prison. Bob and Linda Hayes, who'd raised me and supported me through nursing school and walked me down the aisle at my wedding, were going to federal prison for stealing my identity and defrauding our community. That night, Jessica called me from Columbus, where she'd moved in with a friend to escape the scandal. Sarah, I'm sorry. I should have told you what they were doing sooner. I should have protected you instead of protecting myself. Jess, you were scared. I understand that. No, you don't understand. I have recordings? Conversations between mom and dad about expanding their schemes, about targeting more people, about making sure you never found out. The FBI wants them for evidence. Recordings that would help convict our parents and send them to prison for years. Evidence that my own sister had been gathering while watching me struggle to pay bills and wondering why my family treated me like a financial burden. The investigation was almost over, but the real consequences were just beginning. The arrest happened on a Sunday morning during the 10:30 service at Sacred Heart Church. I wasn't there to see it, but Father Martinez called me 20 minutes after it was over, his voice shaking with distress. Sarah, I'm so sorry you have to hear about this secondhand. The FBI came during the opening hymn. They waited until after communion, but still, in front of the entire congregation. I could picture it perfectly. Linda was sitting in her usual third-row pew, probably wearing her navy blue dress with the pearl buttons, the one she thought made her look dignified and respectable. Bob beside her in his only good suit, the one he'd worn to my wedding 8 years ago. Both of them were surrounded by people who'd trusted them, donated money to their fake charities, and listened to their stories about their successful daughter. How did people react? There was crying, shouting, misses. Chen fainted and had to be helped outside. Some of the men wanted to confront the agents, thinking there'd been some mistake. It was chaos, Sarah. Complete chaos. The Cleveland Plain Dealer photographer had been tipped off somehow. The Monday morning paper featured a front-page photo of Bob and Linda being let out of Sacred Heart in handcuffs, with the headline, "Local Couple Accused of Defrauding Church and Family Members." Under that, in smaller print, daughter Sarah Mitchell identified as key witness in federal case. Key witness, not a victim. Not someone who'd had her identity stolen and her life destroyed by the people she'd trusted most. A witness, which made it sound like I'd been watching from the sidelines instead of drowning in the middle of it all. Patricia Wong found me in the hospital cafeteria that afternoon, staring at a cup of coffee I hadn't touched in an hour. "The administration has finished their internal investigation," she said without preamble. "You're cleared of any wrongdoing. You'll be reinstated to full ICU duties starting tomorrow." I should have felt relieved, but mostly I just felt empty. My parents were sitting in federal detention. My daughter was being bullied at school. My face was on the front page of the newspaper, and somehow going back to taking care of critically ill patients was supposed to make everything normal again. "Thank you. I know you advocated for me." Patricia sat down across from me and leaned forward, speaking quietly. "Sarah, I need you to know that what happened to you could happen to anyone. Family financial abuse is more common than people realize, and it's especially hard to detect when the abusers are this sophisticated." That afternoon, I drove to the Cuyahoga County Jail to see my parents for the first time since their arrest. The visiting room was sterile and depressing, filled with orange plastic chairs and the smell of industrial disinfectant. Bob and Linda were brought in wearing matching jail uniforms, looking older and smaller than I remembered. Linda started crying the moment she saw me. "Sarah, honey, you have to help us. This is all a terrible misunderstanding. We never meant to hurt anyone. You stole $89,000 using my name, Mom. You made me pay rent in my own apartment while you were committing federal fraud with my identity. How is that a misunderstanding? Bob leaned forward, his eyes hard with the same anger I'd seen that night he'd hit me. You're destroying this family over money, Sarah. After everything we've done for you, this is how you repay us. Even in jail, facing federal charges, he still couldn't accept responsibility for what they'd done. In his mind, I was still the ungrateful daughter, the one causing problems by refusing to enable their lies. The conversation lasted 15 minutes and accomplished nothing except to confirm what I already knew. My parents were never going to apologize, never going to acknowledge the pain they'd caused, never going to take responsibility for the lives they'd destroyed in pursuit of easy money. David called me that evening from a treatment facility in Columbus where he'd finally checked himself in for his gambling addiction. His voice sounded different, clearer somehow, like he was seeing the world without the fog of addiction for the first time in years. Sarah, I've been working with a counselor here, and I'm starting to understand how Mom and Dad used my addiction to manipulate me into helping them. They knew I'd do anything to avoid confrontation to keep peace in the family. Are you going to testify at the trial? Yes. My counselor says it's part of taking responsibility for my part in what happened. I helped them steal from you, even if I didn't understand what I was doing at the time. Agent Rivera called the next week with victim impact assessments that painted a devastating picture of community damage. $89,000 in direct financial losses, but the emotional trauma extended far beyond the money. Mrs. Chen had been hospitalized for anxiety after learning that her charitable donations had been stolen. 3 construction workers had lost their retirement savings and were talking about having to work into their 70s. The Sacred Heart Building Fund was $15,000 short of what they needed for essential repairs. But perhaps the most heartbreaking call came from Emma's school counselor. Sarah, we need to discuss Emma's situation. She's been having some behavioral issues that we think are stress-related. Acting out in class, having trouble focusing, getting into arguments with other children. Is it still about bullying? That's part of it, but there's something else. Emma drew a picture yesterday during art therapy that concerns us. It shows her family, but she's drawn herself alone on one side of the paper, with everyone else on the other side. When we asked her about it, she said she doesn't know which family she belongs to anymore. 7 years old, and already learning that the people who are supposed to protect you can be the ones who hurt you most. Already understanding that family loyalty and family love aren't always the same thing. Marcus Thompson called that Friday with news about the trial timeline. Jury selection would begin in 18 months, which felt like both forever and no time at all. 18 months to prepare myself to testify against my parents in open court, to have my financial records and personal life dissected by defense attorneys, to watch my family destroy itself in front of strangers. The federal prosecutor wants to meet with you next week to begin preparation for your testimony, he told me. They're offering full immunity in exchange for your cooperation, but they need to understand exactly what you knew and when you knew it. Full immunity for crimes I'd never committed by people who'd used my name and identity to destroy other people's lives. It felt like being thanked for surviving an accident that never should have happened in the first place. That night, I tucked Emma into bed and tried to answer her questions about why her grandparents weren't coming to visit anymore, why people at school were saying mean things about our family, why everything had changed so suddenly. Mommy or Grandpa and Grandma ever coming home? I don't know, sweetheart. They made some very serious mistakes, and they have to face the consequences for those mistakes. Do you still love them? I paused, trying to find words that were honest but age-appropriate, that acknowledged the complexity of loving people who'd betrayed you completely. I love the people they used to be, Emma. But love doesn't mean accepting behavior that hurts other people. Sometimes loving someone means letting them face the consequences of their choices. She nodded like she understood, but I could see the confusion in her eyes. 7 years old was too young to learn about the difference between loving people and enabling their harmful behavior. But life doesn't always wait until you're ready for its lessons. The trial was still 18 months away, but I was already learning that justice is a long, complicated process that damages everyone it touches, even the people it's supposed to protect. 14 months passed before the pre-trial hearings finally began. 14 months of living in limbo, of Emma asking when things would go back to normal, of seeing my parents' mugshots in newspaper articles every few weeks as new details emerged about their fraud operation. I'd been meeting with the federal prosecutor assistant U.S. Attorney Michelle Rodriguez once a month to prepare my testimony. She was a woman in her early 40s with kind but determined eyes who explained the legal process in terms I could understand without making me feel stupid for asking questions. Sarah, I need you to understand that the defense is going to attack your character and your motives. They're going to try to paint you as a vindictive daughter who's seeking revenge against parents who were just trying to help the family financially. How can they say that when there's so much evidence? Evidence doesn't always matter as much as the story the jury believes. Bob's attorney is going to argue that family financial arrangements are complicated, that misunderstandings happen. That criminal intent is hard to prove when families share resources. The first pre-trial hearing was held in the federal courthouse in downtown Cleveland, an imposing building with marble columns and security checkpoints that made everything feel more serious than I was prepared for. I sat in the gallery behind the prosecution table, watching my parents appear in court wearing the navy blue suits their attorneys had probably told them would make them look respectable and remorseful. Bob's lawyer was a man named Kenneth Walsh, who specialized in white-collar defense cases. During his opening remarks to the judge, he outlined a defense strategy that made my stomach turn. Your Honor, we intend to show that the financial arrangements between Mr. Hayes and his daughter were consensual family agreements that have been mischaracterized by federal prosecutors seeking to criminalize normal family financial support systems. Normal family financial support systems. As if stealing my identity and defrauding our community was somehow just an unconventional way of managing household expenses. Linda's attorney, a woman named Patricia Brennan, took a different approach. She argued that Linda was a victim of her husband's gambling addiction, manipulated into participating in schemes she didn't understand. Mrs. Hayes is a part-time church secretary with no experience in financial matters. She trusted her husband to handle the family's financial affairs and was unaware of the criminal nature of his activities. Unaware. Linda, who'd forged my signature on dozens of documents, who'd collected money from elderly parishioners for fake charities, who'd looked me in the eye for months while stealing my identity, was supposedly just an innocent bystander. The most difficult moment came when the defense requested access to Emma's therapy records. They wanted to subpoena the counseling notes from her sessions, claiming they needed to understand the family dynamics that had led to my decision to cooperate with federal prosecutors. Judge Morrison, a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and no tolerance for legal nonsense, appointed a guardian ad litem named Robert Chen to protect Emma's interests. During the proceedings, Mr. Chen was a family law attorney who specialized in representing children caught up in adult legal battles. He explained his role to Emma and me during our first meeting at his office. Emma, my job is to make sure that whatever happens in this court case, your privacy and your well-being are protected. You don't have to talk to any lawyers or answer any questions unless I think it's absolutely necessary. Emma, now 8 years old and wiser than she should have been, nodded solemnly. Are my grandparents going to jail? That's for the judge and jury to decide, sweetheart. But whatever happens, it won't be your fault, and you'll be safe. The plea negotiations broke down completely in November. Bob refused to accept responsibility for anything, insisting that family business should have stayed private and that I was destroying the family by cooperating with federal prosecutors. Linda's attorney tried to negotiate a plea deal based on her supposed limited involvement, but the prosecutors had too much evidence of her active participation in the fraud schemes. Marcus Thompson called me after the final plea hearing to deliver news that felt both inevitable and devastating. Sarah, they've rejected all plea offers. This is going to trial, full trial probably lasting 2 weeks, with extensive media coverage and public testimony from all the victims. 2 weeks of sitting in a federal courtroom, reliving every detail of how my parents had stolen my identity and destroyed my trust. 2 weeks of having defense attorneys question my motives and my character in front of reporters and spectators and a jury of strangers who would decide whether my parents spent the rest of their productive years in federal prison. The community healing had already begun in small ways. Sacred Heart Church had implemented new financial oversight procedures, with all donations now requiring 2 signatures and monthly audits by a volunteer committee. Father Martinez had organized financial literacy classes for elderly parishioners who'd been targeted by the fraud schemes. The Construction Workers Union had developed a warning system about workplace investment scams, and several members had spoken to local news outlets about the importance of verifying investment opportunities through legitimate financial advisors. But the personal healing felt much more complicated. I'd started seeing a trauma counselor named Dr. Emily Foster, who specialized in family financial abuse cases. She helped me understand that what I'd experienced had a name, patterns that were recognizable and treatable. Sarah. Financial abuse often involves family members because trust makes victims more vulnerable. The people closest to us have access to our personal information, our mail, our daily routines. They know our weaknesses and our fears. Is it normal that I still love them even after everything they've done? Love doesn't disappear just because someone betrays you. But healthy love requires boundaries, and boundaries require consequences. You're allowing them to face the natural consequences of their choices, which is actually an act of love even if it doesn't feel that way, Dr. Foster helped me see that my guilt about testifying against my parents was misplaced. I wasn't destroying my family by telling the truth. They'd destroyed it by choosing to commit crimes using my identity. Emma was doing better in therapy, but she still asked difficult questions that I struggled to answer honestly, without overwhelming her with adult complexities. Mommy, when the trial is over, will we be a normal family again? We'll be our own kind of normal, sweetheart. Different from what we had before, but honest and safe and built on truth instead of lies. The trial was scheduled to begin in 3 months. 3 months to prepare myself emotionally for what would probably be the most difficult experience of my adult life. 3 months to help Emma understand why Mommy was going to spend 2 weeks talking to strangers about the people who used to be her grandparents. The federal courthouse would become our second home for a while, the place where we'd finally learn whether justice and family loyalty could somehow coexist, or whether choosing one meant losing the other forever. The federal trial began on a cold Tuesday morning in March, almost 2 years after that night when I'd first discovered the unopened mail. In my bedroom, the courthouse was packed with reporters, victims, and spectators who'd been following the case in the local media for months. I sat in the front row behind the prosecution table, wearing a navy blue dress that Patricia Wong had helped me choose because it looked professional but not expensive. Emma was at school, thankfully unaware that today was the day her mother would testify against her. Grandparents in federal court. Assistant U.S. Attorney Michelle Rodriguez delivered an opening statement that laid out the scope of Bob and Linda's fraud operation with devastating clarity. She showed the jury charts documenting $89,000 in losses, photographs of forged documents, and timelines that proved systematic criminal intent over 3 years. The defendants exploited their daughter's professional reputation as a registered nurse to gain the trust of vulnerable community members. They used her identity without her knowledge or consent to commit wire fraud, identity theft, and mail fraud on a scale that devastated families throughout Northeast Ohio. Bob's attorney, Kenneth Walsh, painted a very different picture during his opening statement. He portrayed my parents as desperate people who'd made poor financial decisions during difficult times, but who'd never intended to hurt anyone. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about a family financial arrangement that got complicated and eventually got out of hand. Hayes and his wife were trying to keep their family together during Bob's disability and unemployment, and they made some mistakes in how they handled shared family resources. Linda's attorney, Patricia Brennan, went even further, essentially throwing Bob under the bus while portraying Linda as a victim of domestic manipulation. Mrs. Hayes is a part-time church secretary with no criminal history who trusted her husband to handle financial matters she didn't understand. She was as much a victim of Mr. Hayes's deception as anyone else in this courtroom. The first week of testimony focused on the victims. Mrs. Chen took the stand wearing her best dress, a simple blue outfit she'd probably sewn herself, and told the jury about giving $50 a month to Linda's fake charity for 8 months. I work very hard for my money, she said in heavily accented English. I sew clothes, I fix things for people. $50 is grocery money for 2 weeks, but I give it because I think I help sick children in Honduras. When the prosecutor asked how she felt when she learned the charity didn't exist, Mrs. Chen started crying. I feel foolish. I feel like bad person for trusting someone from my church. Now I don't know who to trust anymore. Jim Kowalski testified about investing his wife's knee surgery money in Bob's pharmaceutical stock scheme. His testimony was even more heartbreaking because of his obvious embarrassment at being deceived by someone he'd considered a friend. Bob showed me paperwork with Sarah's name on it, said she had inside information about drug companies, about which treatments were getting approved by the FDA. I trusted him because I trusted her. I've known Sarah since she was a little girl. By the end of the first week, the prosecution had painted a clear picture of systematic predatory behavior, targeting the most vulnerable members of our community. Elderly immigrants, disabled construction workers, churchgoers who trusted their parish secretary. People who had very little money to lose but who'd lost it anyway because they'd believed my parents' lies about my involvement. My testimony began on Monday of the second week. I'd rehearsed with Michelle Rodriguez dozens of times, but nothing could have prepared me for the reality of sitting in a federal courtroom looking at my parents while describing how they'd stolen my identity and destroyed my trust. Miss Mitchell, when did you first discover that credit accounts had been opened in your name without your permission? The night after my father hit me for asking them to help with Emma's medical expenses, I found bank statements and credit card applications hidden in my bedroom, accounts I'd never opened showing thousands of dollars in debt. Bob's attorney objected several times during my testimony, trying to characterize the financial arrangements as consensual family agreements rather than identity theft, but the evidence was overwhelming. Forged signatures, intercepted mail, credit applications using my information without my knowledge or consent. Miss Mitchell, did you ever give your parents permission to use your name or professional credentials to solicit investments or charitable donations from community members? Never. I had no knowledge of any charity work being done in my name, and I certainly never provided investment advice to anyone about pharmaceutical stocks or any other financial matters. The cross-examination was brutal but expected. Kenneth Walsh tried to paint me as an ungrateful daughter who'd turned against my parents over money, but Michelle Rodriguez had prepared me well for his attacks. Miss Mitchell, isn't it true that you lived in your parents' home rent-free for 4 years? No, that's not true. I lived in my own apartment and paid my parents $400 a month in rent for their room. Plus, I covered most of the utilities and grocery expenses. But you never contributed to their medical expenses or helped them during their financial difficulties. I contributed thousands of dollars over 4 years while working double shifts as an ICU nurse and raising my daughter alone. The difference is that I thought I was helping them voluntarily, not having my identity stolen to fund their criminal activities. The most devastating testimony came from David, who'd been clean and sober for over a year by the time he took the stand. He explained how our parents had manipulated his gambling addiction to get him to help with their fraud schemes. They told me Sarah was too busy to handle the family financial stuff herself, so she'd ask them to manage it for her. They needed me to set up email accounts and automatic transfers to simplify everything. I was desperate to avoid conflict, so I did what they asked without questioning it. The defense tried to discredit David by focusing on his addiction history, but his testimony was too detailed and too consistent with the documentary evidence to dismiss. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. 4 hours to decide whether my parents had committed federal crimes or had simply made some poor financial decisions during difficult family circumstances. When they returned with guilty verdicts on all 25 counts against Bob and 20 counts against Linda, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph or satisfaction or even relief, just exhaustion and sadness that it had taken a federal criminal trial to establish basic facts about what had happened to my family. Judge Morrison scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later. Bob faced up to 12 years in federal prison. Linda faced up to 8 years. The restitution hearing would determine how much of the $89,000 in victim losses they'd be required to repay, though everyone understood that federal prison wages would make full restitution unlikely. As I walked out of that courthouse with the late afternoon sun hitting my face, reporters shouting questions I didn't answer, I realized that the trial was over, but the real work of rebuilding our lives was just beginning. Justice has been served, but justice doesn't repair the relationships it destroys or heal the communities it's supposed to protect. That would take something else entirely, something that would require more courage than testifying against my own parents had demanded. 18 months after the trial, I was finally beginning to understand what rebuilding looked like. The financial recovery had been surprisingly straightforward once the identity theft victim procedures kicked in. Marcus Thompson had helped me navigate the maze of credit disputes, and one by one the fraudulent accounts disappeared from my credit reports. My student loans were consolidated at a lower interest rate, and I'd managed to negotiate the medical debt from Michael's treatment down to a manageable monthly payment. For the first time in years, I could pay my bills without using credit cards or borrowing money from coworkers. The emotional recovery was more complicated. Emma was 9 now, old enough to understand more about what had happened, but still young enough to believe that adult problems could be fixed with enough love and good intentions. Mommy, do you think Grandpa and Grandma are sorry for what they did? I hope they are, sweetheart. But sometimes people can't admit they were wrong, even when they hurt people they love. We were sitting in our new apartment in Shaker Heights, a 2-bedroom place with hardwood floors and windows that let in actual sunlight. I'd been promoted to charge nurse at Cleveland Clinic, which came with a salary increase to $72,000 and the kind of professional respect I'd never experienced before. Emma's art therapy sessions showed remarkable progress. The drawings that had once featured dark, angry faces and family members, separated by walls, now showed bright colors and people holding hands. Her school counselor reported that she was making friends easily and excelling in her classes. My relationship with David had slowly healed over the months. He'd completed his gambling addiction treatment program and had been clean for 2 years. We met for coffee once a month, always at the same diner near his apartment in Parma, always careful to keep our conversations focused on the present rather than relitigating the past. Sarah, I need to tell you something I've never said before. I was jealous of you for years. You had your life together, you were successful, you were everything Mom and Dad wanted in a daughter. When they asked me to help with the financial stuff, part of me was glad to finally be useful to the family. That must have been difficult to carry around. It was. But my counselor helped me understand that jealousy and addiction made me vulnerable to manipulation. I wasn't responsible for their crimes, but I was responsible for getting healthy, so I couldn't be used like that. Again. David worked in IT support now, helping elderly residents at an assisted living facility learn how to video chat with their families. It was honest work that used his technical skills in ways that helped people instead of hurting them. The community healing at Sacred Heart Church had been more successful than anyone expected. Father Martinez had organized financial literacy workshops that drew participants from across the immigrant community, not just church members. Mrs. Chen had become one of the volunteer instructors, teaching people how to recognize investment scams and verify charitable organizations. Sarah, you should be proud of what came out of this terrible situation. We've helped dozens of families protect themselves from fraud because of what we learned from your parents' case. Father Martinez visited me at the hospital one afternoon to ask if I'd consider speaking at one of their workshops. The request surprised me because I'd been avoiding Sacred Heart since the trial, unsure how the congregation felt about the daughter who'd sent their former secretary to federal prison. People need to hear from someone who survived family financial abuse. Your story could help others recognize the warning signs before they lose their life savings. I thought about Mrs. Chen, who'd been so grateful for Linda's fake charity that she'd continued donating, even when it meant eating rice and beans for dinner every night. About Jim Kowalski, whose wife still limped because they couldn't afford her knee replacement surgery after losing their savings to Bob's investment scam. I'll do it, but only if we focus on prevention and recovery, not on what happened to my family specifically. The workshop was held on a Saturday afternoon in the church basement, the same room where I'd attended potluck dinners and holiday parties as a child. 23 people attended, mostly elderly residents from the surrounding neighborhoods, but also some younger families who'd heard about the free financial education classes. I talked about recognizing family financial abuse, about the difference between helping relatives and enabling their harmful behavior, about the importance of maintaining financial boundaries even with people you love. I didn't mention my parents by name or go into details about the criminal case, but everyone in that room understood the context. Afterward, a woman named Maria Gonzalez approached me. She was probably in her 50s, with worried eyes and calloused hands that spoke of years of hard work. My son keeps asking me to co-sign loans for his business, she said quietly. He says it's just temporary help that he'll pay everything back. But I'm starting to wonder if he's telling me the truth about how much money he needs. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. And remember that helping someone sometimes means saying no, even when they don't understand why. Cleveland Clinic had started using my case as a training example for their employee assistance program. Patricia Wong had asked me to consult on policies for helping healthcare workers who were experiencing financial abuse at home. Sarah, you'd be surprised how common this is. We've had 3 nurses this year who discovered that family members were using their professional credentials for fraudulent activities. Your experience could help us develop better support protocols. The work felt meaningful in ways that patient care sometimes didn't. I was still helping people, but I was helping them protect themselves before they got hurt rather than treating them after the damage was done. Eleanor Rosenberg had become an unofficial grandmother figure for Emma. The elderly woman lived next door to our new apartment and had taken it upon herself to teach Emma how to bake cookies and tend a small garden on her back porch. Emma needs to know that not all adults will disappoint her, she told me one afternoon while we watched Emma plant tomato seeds in tiny pots. She needs to see that trustworthy people still exist in the world. Eleanor was right. Emma needed examples of healthy adult relationships, people who kept their promises and respected boundaries and told the truth, even when it was inconvenient. She needed to see that her grandparents' behavior was the exception, not the rule. On the second anniversary of their conviction, I received a letter from Linda in federal prison in Alderson, West Virginia. It was the first communication I'd had from either of my parents since the sentencing hearing 2 years earlier. The letter was 3 pages of self-pity and blame, full of complaints about prison conditions and veiled accusations that I'd abandoned my family when they needed me most. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the harm they'd caused, no recognition that their actions had consequences for anyone but themselves. I read it once, then put it in the shredder without responding. Some relationships can't be repaired, and some people never accept responsibility for the damage they cause. Learning to accept that reality had been one of the hardest parts of my recovery, but also one of the most liberating. Emma was thriving in ways I'd never expected. Her teacher had nominated her for the school's character award after she'd helped organize a fundraiser for families affected by financial fraud. At 9 years old, she understood something about justice and protection that many adults never learned. The healing wasn't complete and probably never would be, but it was real and it was growing stronger every day. We were building something new from the wreckage of what we'd lost, something honest and healthy and built on truth instead of lies. Chapter 10. Condensed version, 1,000 words, 3 years after the convictions. I found myself standing in Cleveland Clinic's auditorium, holding an award I'd never expected to receive, the Ethics in Healthcare Award, presented annually to one employee who demonstrated exceptional integrity in the face of professional challenges. Patricia Wong had nominated me, writing that my willingness to expose financial crimes despite personal cost had protected not only my colleagues but the broader healthcare community from fraud schemes targeting medical professionals. Bob was still serving his sentence at the federal facility in Kentucky, with no contact allowed per the restraining order. Linda had been released after serving 3 years and moved to Florida, sending occasional birthday cards to Emma that we screened carefully before deciding whether to share them. Emma was 10 now, and her school essay about courage had been selected for the district's character education program. She'd written about learning the difference between family loyalty and enabling harmful behavior. My mom taught me that doing the right thing isn't always the easy thing, but it's always the important thing. Sometimes loving someone means letting them face consequences for their choices, even when it makes you sad. Her teacher, Mrs. Anderson, had called me after reading the essay. Sarah, Emma has a wisdom about family relationships that's remarkable for her age. She's helping other children in our class who are dealing with difficult family situations at home. David's recovery had continued steadily. 4 years sober, working as an IT coordinator at the Veterans Administration Hospital, helping disabled veterans access online services and benefits. We'd rebuilt our relationship gradually, through family therapy sessions and carefully supervised visits with Emma. He'd married a woman named Rebecca who worked as a substance abuse counselor and understood the complexities of addiction recovery within families. Their relationship was healthy in ways that were unfamiliar to both of us, built on honesty and mutual support rather than manipulation and codependency. The financial literacy workshops at Sacred Heart Church had expanded into a community-wide program serving 5 neighborhoods. I spoke at these events quarterly, sharing strategies for protecting personal information and recognizing family financial abuse patterns. During one workshop, a man named Carlos approached me afterward with tears in his eyes. My brother has been asking me to co-sign credit cards for his business for 2 years. I kept saying yes because I felt guilty for having steady work when he struggles. After hearing you speak, I realized I wasn't helping him. I was enabling him to avoid dealing with his real financial problems. Dr. Patricia Wong had been promoted to Chief Nursing Officer, and she'd asked me to develop training protocols for healthcare workers experiencing financial abuse at home. The program now served hospitals throughout Northeast Ohio. On a warm Saturday afternoon in May, I took Emma to visit Michael's grave at Riverside Cemetery. We brought fresh flowers, white lilies that had been his favorites, and spent time cleaning the headstone and tending the small garden we'd planted around it. Mommy, do you think Daddy would be proud of what we did? I knelt down beside her, brushing grass clippings off the marble headstone that read Michael David, Mitchell, beloved husband and father. I think Daddy would be proud that we chose truth over family secrets, Emma. That we built real security through honest work and healthy relationships instead of lies and manipulation. We spent the next hour working in the soil, our hands dirty and our hearts lighter. Emma chattered about her friends at school, her plans for summer camp, her excitement about starting 5th grade in the fall. Normal 10-year-old concerns that felt precious because they represented the stability and security we'd fought so hard to build. The drive home took us past my old neighborhood, past the apartment where Bob and Linda had lived with us for 4 years while stealing my identity and defrauding our community. New tenants lived there now, a young family with small children who played in the front yard. Emma noticed me looking at the building and asked quietly, "Do you miss living there?" "I miss the idea of having a normal family, sweetheart. But I don't miss living with people who lied to us every day. Our life now is smaller, but it's honest, and that makes it better." That evening, I called my cousin Maria to confirm plans for our family reunion next month. The extended family relationships had healed more easily than I'd expected. Once everyone understood that they'd been victims of Bob and Linda's manipulation just like I had. "Sarah, you saved my retirement fund. Mom was planning to give Linda $3,000 for your fake medical mission charity. If you hadn't spoken up when you did, we could have lost everything we'd saved for her assisted living care." As I tucked Emma into bed that night, she asked me one of those questions that reminded me how much she'd grown through this experience. "Mom, are we brave?" I brushed her hair back from her forehead, looking into eyes that held more wisdom than a 10-year-old should need, but that sparkled with the resilience children possess when they're truly loved and protected. "We're learning to be brave every day, sweetheart. Brave enough to tell the truth even when it's difficult. Brave enough to protect people even when it costs us something. Brave enough to build a family based on love instead of lies." I learned that justice isn't revenge, it's preventing others from being hurt. Family loyalty means protecting innocent people, not enabling harmful behavior. Real love requires courage to do what's right, not what's easy. Sometimes the family you choose, the people who show up with honesty and support, matters more than the family you're born into. Financial abuse in families happens more often than people want to admit, and it can happen to anyone regardless of education, income, or professional success. If this story sounds familiar to you, if you're questioning financial arrangements with family members that don't feel right, know that help is available and you're not alone. Trust your instincts. Document everything, seek professional advice, and remember that protecting yourself and your children from financial predators isn't betrayal, even when the predators are people you love. Sometimes the hardest conversations create the most important changes. And sometimes choosing truth over family secrets is the most loving thing you can do for everyone involved.